Well, good. Welcome everyone again. Welcome to the Alden Kindred of America's presentation of Mayflower Lives, a fresh and revealing look. My name is Desiree Mobed, and I'm the executive director. The Alden Kindred of America preserves and shares the legacy of Mayflower passengers John and Priscilla Alden at their homestead in Duxbury, Massachusetts, through guided tours, educational programs like this, exhibitions, genealogical research, and publications. I'd like to offer a very special welcome to our members who are joining us today, whose support helps make programs like this possible. Today, we are delighted to welcome British author and historian Martyn Whittock, whose acclaimed book, Mayflower Lives, explores this voyage through the lives of 14 very remarkable individuals, saints and strangers, who together became known as the Pilgrims. Their stories reveal the human drama behind this founding narrative, the difficult crossing, that brutal first winter, and the forging of their fragile community. From the familiar names to some lesser known voices, Martyn will offer a fascinating portrait of the men, women, and children who helped shape one of the earliest chapters of American history. I had the pleasure of meeting Martyn at the Alden House during his visit to the United States while he was conducting research for this book, and it's a joy to welcome him back, although virtually, to share the insights that grew into this work. Martyn is the author or co-author of 58 books, spanning many historical and theological themes. He serves as a lay minister for the Church of England and is a frequent commentator and columnist, contributing to print and online platforms and appearing on television and radio to discuss the intersections of history, faith, and the modern world. We are recording this program and we'll be posting it within a few days on the Alden website. And now I would like to welcome Martyn Whittock. Welcome, Martyn.
Well, it's great to be with you. Greetings and best wishes from the United Kingdom, and it is great to be with you this afternoon. So I'd like to introduce you to Mayflower Lives, which is something of a personal journey for myself. At university in the UK, I specialised in Christian radicals of the British Civil Wars of the 17th century. People who wished to, as they saw it, purify the Church of England and build a new Jerusalem on earth. I've remained fascinated by them ever since. The second formative experience was co-writing with my youngest daughter, Christ the First 2,000 Years. Once again, I made the acquaintance of these radicals. Then my book, When God Was King, Rebels and Radicals of the Civil War and Mayflower Generation, explored the Puritan experience in the British Isles and North America. It should be noted that on my side of the pond, any reference to a civil war is to the one in the 17th century. While we often refer to them as Puritans, they preferred to identify with labels such as the godly and the saints. Those outside their communities, they often labelled as strangers. Some of the godly were separatists. They wanted to meet separate from the legally enforced Protestant Church of England, of which I am now a lay minister. Others were non-separating. They wished to remain part of a national church, but with each congregation enjoying a fairly large amount of autonomy. As I wrote it, I felt very connected to the world of the Mayflower, since its story, woven deep into the cultural DNA of the USA, is also a British one. For both before and after the journey, they remained connected to a nation spiralling down to the British Civil Wars of the 1640s. Consequently, the Mayflower story is a uniting factor between two Atlantic communities which would eventually take separate but related paths of national development. But how to choose 14 Mayflower Lives? Reading the Mayflower literature impressed me deeply with the depth and breadth of the existing historical scholarship, which is fully referenced and acknowledged in the final book. However, as I explored, I also felt a need to connect with the personal experiences of those involved, the his story and the her story of history. And that drove the concept of Mayflower Lives, to engage with the events through a sample, in this case 14, of lives involved. I wanted each life to open up a window on a particular aspect of the voyage and then on the early American experience, as revealed in other evidence beyond their biographical details, about Puritan outlooks and society. On top of that, I wanted my selection to chart a broadly chronological course through the events, so that readers could get an idea of cause, course, and consequence. Making the selection involved an extensive period of noting names, evidence, and experiences, comparing and contrasting the personalities, reflecting on what they revealed about wider issues, deciding the breadth and chronology emerging from these selected lives. Finally, I made my selection. There are saints and strangers. Some were women, some were men. One was a little child who did not survive the first winter. One was a Native American. But all the lives are insightful. So, my final selection, and my apologies to those who didn't make the cut, were: first, Christopher Jones, master of the Mayflower. We're fairly sure that he was born in Harwich, Essex, in about 1570. In 1611, Jones and his family moved to Rotherhithe on the south bank of the River Thames. In 1611, a salvage claim names him as the master of the Mayflower. It looks as if he'd acquired it before he moved to Rotherhithe, and he was its part owner. Mayflower was a freight galleon with a crew of about 30. Choosing Jones opened a window onto the history of that famous ship. Sailing in Mayflower, he was mostly involved in trade to continental Europe. But none of these journeys on Mayflower took him into the Atlantic. So the voyage of 1620 was to test him and the ship to its limits. In fact, the Mayflower was a pretty old ship by the time she took part in the famous and difficult voyage. He and his ship became part of the venture because those backing it were looking for a low price. As we all know, after a tough crossing and a winter spent moored off the Massachusetts coast while disease ravaged the settlers and sailors, he sailed back to England in 1621, only to die in 1622, aged about 52. Mayflower was broken up in 1624, having been in ruins since the voyage of 1620 to 21. What's astonishing is that nobody who recorded the events of the famous voyage mentioned the name of the ship involved. Mayflower battled the Atlantic and the winter off Cape Cod in anonymity. William Bradford and Edward Winslow simply refer to her as the bigger ship, the larger ship, and the vessel. It was only the allotment of lands in 1623 that first mentions the name of this crucial player in these great events. William Bradford, a saint fleeing Babylon. William provided an opportunity to look at how Puritan beliefs could radically change, and we might say in our common parlance of today, radicalize a person. Puritan beliefs could radically change and perhaps radicalize a person and decide the course of their life. Coming from Austerfield, South Yorkshire, he felt seriously ill and over the course of months confined to his room underwent a profound conversion which left him deeply dissatisfied with the state of the Church of England. As a result, he joined the illegal separatist congregation at nearby Scrooby and eventually emigrated with it to the Netherlands in search of religious freedom. He, of course, became a leading member of the fellowship and in the decision to move to the New World. From 1621 to his death in 1657, he was frequently elected governor. However, one person who did not see or share in any of William's achievements was Dorothy Bradford. When William Bradford returned from an expedition exploring the bay behind Cape Cod in December 1620, he found that she had fallen from the deck of the Mayflower and drowned in the freezing cold waters of the sheltered anchorage. Her death reminds us of the extreme nature of the venture and its toll on those involved. And of course, Bradford's of Plymouth plantation is, as we know, a key source of information. Susanna White, mother. Susanna was pregnant when she boarded the Mayflower in the company of her husband William and their son Resolved, a classic godly name. Including Susanna provided a vivid way to explore something of the female experience and childbirth, being one of 3 pregnant women to endure the terrible weeks of the sea crossing. Susanna gave birth to a son who was named Peregrine, meaning pilgrim, late in November 1620, while Mayflower was anchored in the shelter of Cape Cod. He was the first European born in New England. Her husband died that first winter and she married Edward Winslow, the famous leader amongst the separatists. We know little in detail about her personal life in Plymouth after her marriage to Winslow in 1621. Although he visited England several times on Plymouth or Massachusetts colony business, there's no evidence that Susanna left New England with him. When he eventually died in 1655 in the West Indies on a military mission for Oliver Cromwell's government, he'd been apart from Susanna for almost 10 years. After he died, Susanna was supported by 1/3 of his estate in and around Marshfield until her own death. By that time, she'd become the relatively wealthy widow of one of the foremost citizens of Plymouth Colony and the mother of a man who was also a leading and highly influential figure. It was a far cry from the desperate situation she'd faced in February 1621, when widowed with 2 small children. But even so, her life had been far from easy, and she had made real emotional sacrifices for the colony. Stephen Hopkins, survivor of shipwreck and with unique New World experience. His wife, Elizabeth, gave birth to the only child born on the actual voyage of the Mayflower, appropriately called Oceanus Hopkins. Stephen Hopkins, the evidence suggests, was one of the so-called strangers, those not personally known to the Leiden congregation. And this reminds us of the complex nature of the community on board. His life also reminds us that the Mayflower settlement built on a growing experience of the North Atlantic world that was drawing North America and Europe together. Alone among the passengers, he had prior experience of the New World, having been shipwrecked on the Bermudas in 1609, an event giving rise to Shakespeare's play The Tempest. Consequently, in 1620, he brought valuable experience to the Mayflower venture. Given his background in North America, it's not surprising that he took part in the early exploring of Cape Cod, including the famous first encounter with Native Americans. In Plymouth, that kind of experience proved very useful to the other colonists as a direct result of his knowledge of the lifestyles and probably some of the languages of Native Americans, which he'd gained through time earlier spent in Jamestown. When an English-speaking Native American named Samoset first came into Plymouth, he spent the night in the home of Hopkins. The first formal meeting with the local peoples took place in Stephen's home, and he accompanied other leading pilgrims when they visited Massasoit, the overall leader of the Wampanoag Confederacy. He served as an assistant to the colony's governor in 1636, and he volunteered for action in the Pequot War of 1636 to 38, although he didn't actually fight. Including him opened a window onto the complex relationship of Europeans with North America and with its indigenous peoples. But arguably, Stephen remained something of a stranger amongst the saints. He established a tavern and he ran into trouble with authorities on several occasions as a result. Tisquantum, Squanto, Native American. Which brings us to Squanto as the settlers knew him, who opens a window onto something of the complex Native American perspective on European settlers and settlement, as he'd been seized by English slave traders, sold in Spain, had been freed, then lived for a time in London. An extraordinary story. The reality of this trade in human beings can be witnessed in the same Shakespeare play we came across regarding Stephen Hopkins. Because by 1611, the sight of Native Americans on public display in England was sufficiently commonplace to cause Shakespeare to refer to it in The Tempest. Squanto returned to New England with an English expedition in 1619 to find that his tribe had been wiped out by diseases introduced by European fishermen. Acting as an English-speaking intermediary between other Native Americans and the newcomers, he played a vital part in helping the newcomers survive by teaching them native farming skills. However, there was also evidence that Squanto used his influence with the newcomers to increase his power with fellow Native Americans by claiming that he alone could decide if the English were inclined towards peace or war, and that only if he was rewarded by other Native Americans would he protect them from the newcomers. Threatened with death when his fellows realized that he had acted duplicitously, there was now no assurance of safety outside the boundaries of Plymouth until his death. One of the striking ironies of the life of the interpreter that we know as Tisquantum is that all his thoughts have been communicated to us by others. They have become his interpreters. And we always have the nagging doubt that something essential about the man has been lost in translation. Mary Chilton, reputedly the first to step onto Plymouth Rock. And here I tread, as it were, on very dangerous ground. Allegedly, she was the first ashore on Plymouth Rock when the Mayflower finally moored there in December 1620, but there's no mention of the famous rock in any contemporary records, and it's not mentioned as the landing place until 1741, it seems. Despite this, her leap from boat to rock has become the stuff of Mayflower legend, and she gives us the perspective of young women regarding the voyage and settlement and the mythological state and nature of the venture. Her story is based on a Chilton family tradition, apparently first recorded in the mid-18th century, which claims that the teenager, Mary, was the first to get ashore at Plymouth. The problem is there's just no historical documentation whatsoever to support this famous tradition. Furthermore, it's rather odd that the later landing at Boston in 1630 comes with an identical tradition of a young girl, in that case Anne Pollard, leaping to be the first ashore. So one wonders if Plymouth Rock was a localized version of the legend from Boston. What is certain is that nobody at the time reported anything remotely like the claim later made for Mary. In fact, it seems the earliest written reference to any rock at Plymouth dates to the year 1715, when a great rock first appears in the records relating to the boundaries of the town. After this, the fame of the rock grew, and consequently, so did that of Mary. The first real breakthrough for the rock took place in 1741. In that year, a plan to build a wharf out from Plymouth Beach threatened to bury a large stone. This came to the attention of a 95-year-old named Thomas Faunce, who lived 3 miles from the centre of town. It was, he declared, that very boulder which had been the landing place of the first Pilgrims. Plymouth Rock was born. Mary had been one of 11 girls who'd sailed on the Mayflower. Of these, 9 survived the first year at Plymouth. In contrast, only 4 of the 14 adult women survived that first year. If it was hard for the young girls, then it was worse for the women. And in this way, Mary opens a window onto both the growing mythology of the Mayflower adventure and the place of young people and women within it. Mary Moore, unwanted stranger. Little Mary truly was a stranger. She was one of the 4 Moore children travelling without any family because their father believed them, with reason, the children of an adulterous relationship his wife had had with a neighbour. To dispose of them, he sent them to North America as servants, indentured servants. Their mother fought a desperate legal battle to get them back. She failed. 3 of the little children died in the first terrible winter of 1620 to 21. Their mother never saw them again. Little Mary's life and death is a reminder of both the gender inequalities of the 17th century, that the husband could do this, and the social consequences for innocent children tarnished with the sexual sins of others. You know, try as one might, one cannot ignore the fact that the only 2 young girls to die that winter were Ellen and Mary Moore. That seems just too coincidental. One wonders whether there is more to it than meets the eye. Not that one has to suggest foul play or anything remotely like it, more a situation of casual neglect. After all, everyone else was very busy just staying alive themselves that winter. And how were these little children regarded? We hope they were carried and cuddled, comforted and loved. But how likely is that really? Everyone knew why they were aboard. Did people nudge each other, raise eyebrows, frown at the very thought of what they embodied? These were the little bastards. The living proof of the corruption of adultery. If every human being's nature was originally contaminated and depraved, how much more so was theirs? It was woven into their very being and existence. We don't have to suggest active abuse or active unkindness to imagine a situation where they were just the alien others, extreme strangers among the strangers. William Bradford could not even remember Mary's name. When he compiled his journal, he recalled she was a boy, an anonymous boy child. One has a feeling that maybe, just maybe, one of the main reasons why Ellen and Mary Moore died was because they were not loved. John Howland, man overboard. As servant of one of the leading saints, John fell overboard on the stormy crossing, grabbed a trailing rope, and survived. How could I not choose him? He opens a window onto something of the economics also, and settlement rivalries of early New England. And this involved the exploitation of the natural resources of the New World. The earlier Dutch had stumbled onto a veritable gold mine, well, fur mine, which opened up previously unimaginable quantities of beaver fur that was worth a fortune on the European market using wampum, white or purple coloured beads and discs highly praised by Native Americans, as a form of currency. 17th century globalization was drawing the native peoples of the East Coast into an initially mutually advantageous trading system, but one that would eventually undermine Native American society and culture and finally destroy it. It's been estimated that while approximately 12 million beavers are to be found on the North American continent in the 21st century, before Europeans impacted on the population, there may have been as many as 400 million of them. It was European trade that caused the vast reduction. For many Native Americans, the hunting of beaver undermined age-old patterns of land use. By the early years of the 1630s, Plymouth had set up a series of trading posts which ran from the Connecticut River to Maine. John Howland helped establish a trading post on the Kennebec River, and he was present there in 1634 when a conflict with other English settlers led to fatalities on both sides. Including him in the book opened a window onto this key aspect of life in the New World. William Brewster, diplomat and preacher. William was the only Mayflower pilgrim who had political and diplomatic experience in England. He was the only university-educated member of the early colony. As a result of Elizabethan court politics, a diplomatic career faced problems. He went back to Scrooby, where he took on his father's job as postmaster and bailiff. But while he was at Cambridge, William had been influenced by Puritan ideas, radical ideas, and then, whilst travelling to the Netherlands, he'd experienced a society where there was greater religious freedom to practice the reformed Christianity longed for by the godly in England. The Scrooby separatists, of course, finally left England in 1608 on their second attempt. But before that, while at Scrooby, Brewster virtually adopted the young William Bradford. In 1609, the Scrooby group moved to Leiden, and it was there that William Brewster was selected to act as assistant to the Reverend Robinson. When the Leiden congregation were finally ready to send the first group of colonists, it was decided that the Reverend Robinson would stay behind with the majority of the community. This raised the matter of who would provide the spiritual oversight for those who were emigrating. Elder William Brewster took on the role. But before he reached North America, he's the strongest candidate for the person who wrote the Mayflower Compact. But he struggled in his job to find somebody who could take on the role of a regularly ordained minister who had a theological education in Plymouth, with, for example, one whose authority was not accepted and was then involved in a sex scandal, John Lyford, another who proved impossible to work with, Roger Williams, and one who caused tensions by insisting that only full immersion baptism was a valid rite, regardless of the cold in a New England winter. Now, neither Baptists nor Quakers were welcome in any English colony. However, the extreme violence meted out to those in Boston was not fully reflected in Plymouth. About 10 Quakers were deported from Plymouth, with 5 of them being whipped for their expulsion, yet none of them was hanged, or branded, as occurred in Massachusetts Bay. They could even meet in more distant settlements if they kept their heads down. No attempt seems to be made to hunt them out. On balance, Plymouth was not as hard line as Boston, it seems, and gives us some insight into the kind of community that Brewster guided. Edward Winslow, lobbyist. 17th century New England didn't know the term lobbyist, but if it had, it would undoubtedly have been used to describe Edward Winslow, one of the saints, a leading member of the Mayflower community, and then later in Plymouth Colony. Acting as a pamphleteer, promoting the colony and the opportunities provided by North America, he illustrates how PR was important, and he developed good relations with Native Americans too. He served as a member of the Governor's Council from 24 to 47, and the only breaks from this was when he was governor. He was active at the centre of events in the new settlement and was given the responsibility of negotiating with Native Americans living in the vicinity of Plymouth. Winslow's wife, Elizabeth, was one of the last to die that first winter. Then, just a month and a half later, Edward married Susanna White in May. When this occurred, they became the first couple to marry in Plymouth Colony, and it was the Winslows who eventually helped establish one of Plymouth's daughter settlements, that at Marshfield, in 1632. He was the author of several important pamphlets defending the colony and encouraging others to join them. He was also politically active in the godly cause after the execution of Charles I in 1649, when the old country became a republic for 10 years. And from 1646 he was back in England. In 1655 he was sent by Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell to help supervise the English military expedition against the Spanish colonies in the West Indies. And on that mission he died of yellow fever. He's the only Plymouth colonist with a surviving portrait. And from exploring his life, we have access to something of a portrait of what it was like to lead this remarkable colony. Captain Myles Standish. Short of stature, one of his enemies called him Captain Shrimp, but he was an experienced soldier in Europe and not above taking preemptive action if he felt the colony in North America was in danger. Including him reminds one of the vulnerability of the new colony, but also points towards the widespread breakdown of relations with Native Americans that occurred in the next generation. In 1620 he was living in Leiden, and as a fellow Englishman was known to the émigré community there. He was clearly sympathetic to the principles of the godly adventure. But as military commander from February 1621, he intervened using lethal force in an internal Wampanoag power struggle, fortified Plymouth, and then took preemptive action, again using lethal force against Massachusetts Native American leaders at Wessagusset. In 1628, Standish was again on controversial form in what we might call today the Merrymount police action against a poorly behaved, from a Puritan perspective, new colony. As a result, there'll always be an ambiguity in our image of the diminutive captain. This is not simply to apply 21st century moral standards to a 17th century figure, since there were contemporaries of the captain who were also concerned at his willingness to use preemptive violence. He was a complex person in a complex situation. And of course, two for the price of one, Priscilla Mullins and John Alden, famous lovers. Subjects of a famous poem by Longfellow in 1858, these two remind us of the reality of romantic love among the godly. I knew that would surprise a lot of readers who would have been fed a diet of cold, puritanical attitudes. The competition for Priscilla's hand must have been fierce. By the time they married, female mortality and more male arrivals had left her as the only available young woman with a choice of men from, by my reckoning, no less than 18 bachelors. But it was John who succeeded in winning her love. What is clear is that by the time the poet Longfellow had finished with the story, they become America's first couple, and so they remain. When the move to Duxbury occurred, it was John Alden and Myles Standish who were prominent amongst those Plymouth colonists who took part in this expansion of the colony. So perhaps the legendary rivalry was based on a real friendship. And of course, for years, the Alden family passed down a tradition that Alden only won the hand of the beautiful Priscilla after first attempting to court her on behalf of his friend. As a result of this legend, while the names of most of the other female pilgrims have dropped out of memory, that of Priscilla Mullins remains well known. In the legend, of course, John comes nervously to woo the maiden, only to have Priscilla famously ask, "Why don't you speak for yourself, John?" The young woman is clearly not impressed by the captain sending a go-between. That legend first appeared in 1814 in Reverend Timothy Alden's collection of American epitaphs and inscriptions. But the story really became well known when it was a subject of that famous poem, The Courtship of Myles Standish, published by Longfellow in 1858, himself, of course, a Mayflower descendant. Now, among the godly of Plymouth, as within their society generally, love was seen as a product of marriage, not the other way round. In short, a good marriage led to feelings of love. And the feelings that led to the union itself had to be expressed in cool and rational ways. She was a good Christian. She was thrifty, pious, and industrious. But let's not over-stress that. Thomas Hooker, founder of the colony of Connecticut, wrote, "Of the man whose eye is endeared by the woman he loves, he dreams of her in the night, hath her in his eye, and apprehension when he awakes, museth on her as he sits at table, walks with her when he travels, and parleys with her in each place where he comes." Similarly, Edward Taylor may have been living on the wild western frontier of Massachusetts after graduating from Harvard in 1671, but this pastor and poet wrote of his love for his wife as being a golden ball of pure fire. Another clergyman, John Pike, called his wife the desire of mine eyes. William Gouge describes such love as being like fire. Attraction could be strong in the 17th century as in the modern world. Romance could exist. So why should we exclude the possibility of mutual attraction and romantic love in the case of John and Priscilla? And maybe he did go to her on behalf of a tongue-tied Standish. And maybe an intelligent and determined young woman made up her own mind. Maybe they did indeed fall in love. John Billington, plus a few others, straying from the narrow way. What can we say about the Billingtons? John and his family remind us of the problems of building a new Jerusalem. John Billington Sr. was one of the men who signed the Mayflower Compact, but he and his family never signed up to well-behaved living. His son Francis nearly blew up the Mayflower playing with gunpowder. Billington Sr. challenged the drill instructions of Captain Standish, and Standish and the community were having none of it, and he was punished. His other son, John Billington Jr., replicated an earlier wandering off by his brother Francis in straying from the colony and became lost in the woods. For 5 days the boy survived on berries before stumbling on a Native American village and eventually being rescued. Billington Sr. murdered a fellow colonist. For this he was hanged. In 1636, his widow Eleanor Billington continued the family tradition of falling foul of the law when she was sentenced to be fined £5, a lot of money, and to be placed in the stocks and be whipped for slandering another citizen of Plymouth. Other challenges to the godly moral order, not by the Billingtons I must add in this case, included fornication, fighting, theft, a murder of a Native American, infanticide, homosexuality, illegal in the 17th century, attempted incest, one example of bestiality. The latter was by Thomas Granger, who had sex with a mare, a cow, 2 goats, 5 sheep, 2 calves, and a turkey. And it led to a death sentence for the young man and all the animals. However, the double standards that could occur in New England with regard to sexual sin is revealed in the fact that in 1641, while Thomas Granger was executed for sex with animals, a year later, 2 men who together raped an 8 and a 9-year-old girl in their care got off with nothing worse than a fine and a whipping. The difference may have been that Granger was a servant, whereas the more socially superior of the 2 men, the other was a hired hand, who raped the girls, was a member of the church and in good esteem for piety and sobriety. All reminders that it was at times very difficult to build a New Jerusalem. And this chapter in the book opened a window on this shocking side of colony life. And finally, Richard More. Richard was the only one of the 4 More children to survive in 1628. He was apprenticed to Isaac Allerton, and this drew the young man into the adventurous but dangerous world of Atlantic trade. He and his ship fought against the Dutch who were settled on the Hudson River, modern New York area, in 1653. In 1654 to 55, he was again in action, but this time it was against the Catholic French at Port Royal, now in Nova Scotia. He also fought in King Philip's War, probably the most lethal war ever fought between colonists and Native Americans in the 1670s. He moved to Salem. It seems that the church elders at Salem Church had cause to privately speak with him on several occasions, as the records record him as having been for many years under suspicion and common fame of lasciviousness, but had held back from further action due to lack of proof, and we might suggest because of his venerable pedigree as a surviving first comer. He was eventually excommunicated for gross unchastity with another man's wife. However, he made a public repentance and was restored to full fellowship with the church in 1691. He was apparently alive in March 1694, but had died by April 1696. And he died at Salem, shortly after the infamous witch hunts of January 1692 to May 1693 had ended. He was an echo of another world, one in which a struggling little community had first sought to carve out a home for itself in what was for them the American wilderness. He chronologically bookends my story, and with his connection to Salem reminds us of some of the troubling aspects of the Puritan society which eventually emerged by the 1690s. Writing this book changed my perspective on the Mayflower. There were things that particularly stood out to me. The first is their faith. They were courageously committed to follow the path they believed that God had called them to. Without doubt, they and those who came after them in Massachusetts Bay contributed much to the cultural DNA of what would one day become the USA. That legacy is complex and not without controversy at times, but it is very important. The second is their ability to construct an inclusive community. They were both saints and strangers, yet men from both groups signed the Mayflower Compact. Plymouth Colony was no liberal institution, and yet it was more inclusive and less repressive of difference than we find in the semi-theocracy which developed up the coast in Massachusetts Bay Colony. But what finally stood out for me is their ability to work with the people who already lived in the land. That this relationship broke down so terribly and bloodily in the next generation should not obscure the way Pilgrims and local Native Americans generally worked together remarkably harmoniously in the early years. This does not deny the violence of the actions by Standish or the fact that the arrival of Europeans led to catastrophe for indigenous peoples. But it reminds us that war and destruction were not inevitable. There were other paths possible. I hope that I have captured something of the engaging complexity of these remarkable human stories and their impact in Mayflower Lives. They've certainly had an impact on my life. Since the publication of Mayflower Lives, I've explored other deep stories with which people frame the present by reference to the past. Another one with a strong North American theme is American Vikings, how the Norse sailed into the lands and the imaginations of America. Like Mayflower Lives, it is also published by Pegasus Books of New York, as is Tales of Valhalla, Norse Myths and Legends, co-written with my eldest daughter, Hannah. Finally, my latest book, published by Bikeback of London, is Vikings in the East, from Vladimir the Great to Vladimir Putin, the origins of a contested legacy in Russia and Ukraine. Thank you for joining me today.
Martyn, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. And I just wanted to share a little bit about the people who've been joining us today. They coming from around the country, up in Canada, even over in England, where you are. Yes. So, and lots of questions. Certainly a lot of Mayflower descendants and others as well. Some familiar names. And as we're scrolling through, I want to call out to, I think it's Judy Gibson, who I think has about 17 Mayflower lines. If anyone has more, please feel free to share that, but that certainly jumped out. And descendants of many of the people that you shared such beautiful and powerful stories about. I do want to go ahead and just remind you all, if you have specific questions for Martyn, if you could put them in the question and answer function, that would be very helpful. And then I want to share a couple of the questions that came in before the program. And so, Martyn, the first one had to do with indentured servitude. If you want to comment a little bit about that, several of the people who came over, of course, are mentioned as servants. So how that was understood in the 17th century, especially when some of their, the people they worked for died, and how that would have played out in the colony.
Yeah, indentured servants are really very interesting because obviously you could be a servant of somebody and be a free agent effectively. You know, you were working for them, they paid you, and you had a relationship with them not dissimilar to the way in which a modern servant might have with somebody or a modern employee. But an indentured servant was subtly different because effectively they were legally contracted to their employer. Now, it went both ways. The idea was obviously that you contract yourself to somebody who you earned a trade, maybe a shoemaker or a carpenter or something like that. So something came out of that. But there was an expectation that you would stay with that person for the period of whatever the indenture was. So, for example, if you were a child and an indentured servant, then often the idea was you would stay till you were legally an adult, which was 21. And if you ran away or decided to go home, then you were breaking your contractual obligations and could therefore be returned to your employer. So an indentured servant is by no means a slave, but they are by no means a free agent either. They are gaining something from the relationship, but they are tied to that relationship. When their employer dies, It will depend somewhat on the nature of the contractual arrangements being made, which I'm not a full expert on. But my understanding is that that could then free somebody from that. But if they're below the age of adulthood, it would likely them just simply passed on to somebody else. So the more children, for example, were effectively put onto the Mayflower, contractually obligated to go by their father, who had the power to do this, of course. And the mother had to fight a long legal battle. In fact, she was still fighting a strong legal battle a year after they were all dead, apart from Richard, of course. So basically, she basically wanted to get her kids back. But apart from Richard, all three were dead, and she was still going through the court system in England saying, yes, I know they've been contractually committed to this, but it's not right and proper. And they were already dead. So indentured servants did have this tied contractual relationship, which did not give them full freedom.
So, based on your research,
Hmm.
were there any artifacts or, particular documents that just really helped you connect with this story?
I was very moved, particularly when I saw one of the Bibles that is in Plymouth in the museum there. And we were debating this beforehand, weren't we? That actually it's a King James it's a King James Bible. And actually, what's interesting is that most of the separatists actually tended to use the Geneva translation of the Bible, not this newfangled modern translation from 1611 as they would have seen it, because the Geneva Bible was older. But I find that very, very moving, because even though I know the Geneva Bible was more popular among separatists, that has a real possibility of being connected with this venture. And it certainly is a reminder that these were people of great faith. These people really believed that they'd been asked to, cross the Jordan River equivalent, as it were, and they were going into the promised land, which was North America. And they often called it an American Canaan. So it really was quite an intriguing insight. So to look at that, I felt particularly challenging to maybe think about what was driving these people, because in some ways what they were doing was like, well, it wasn't quite like going on a Mars mission, because obviously there was movement backwards and forwards, but a whole bunch of them never went home, and a lot of them died. So it was somewhere between a moon mission and a Mars mission that they kind of embarked on. And they did that because they genuinely believed they were creating a new Jerusalem, in this new world as they saw it. And I think that Bible I found particularly moving. But I also found just other little things in the museum at Plymouth, just little things like, rocking chairs and items. It just thought somebody touched that, somebody was there. And I can remember looking at the Alden house. There's the footprint there, isn't there, of one of the houses there, and other houses in the area, and thinking, gosh, could I actually be standing now right next to the place where this person stood? Am I actually about to step into the living space of that? And so, although that's in the landscape rather than an artifact as such, I find that moving as well, because then you begin to see people in their own context, their own environment. So I find that very moving at the Alden House and some of the other places where you can stand and think, this is not that different to how they would have seen it. So yeah, the landscape also, which I know not an artifact as such, I found very, very moving when I visited New England.
So, based on another question that was asked, is based on your research for this book, are there any aspects, it's certainly a well-known story, often told story, but from your perspective, parts of it that you think are misunderstood or oversimplified today?
Thanksgiving's a classic one. Thanksgiving's a classic one because clearly Thanksgiving happened. The interesting thing is they wouldn't have called it a Thanksgiving. They'd probably called it a harvest home, because they tended to do Thanksgivings for formal days of prayer and fasting and praying for something. So my understanding is they technically wouldn't have called it a Thanksgiving. They'd have called it a harvest home. But I find Thanksgiving fascinating because it is so interesting, because it does give us an insight into the survival of that first winter, that first year. But it also reminds us of the complicated relationship with Native Americans. And so, although in one sense it's become, mythologized and so on and so forth, and obviously normally when we see pictures of it, the Native Americans look like, Plains Indians of the 19th century, and Plains Indians of, Hollywood of the 1960s and 70s. They look at all like Native Americans, indigenous peoples who would have looked in the 17th century. But nevertheless, I find that interesting, exploring Thanksgiving and what it meant to them at the time, and how it related to their understanding of their place in the New World, but also the insight it gives into relationships with Native Americans. And how they turned up and brought things and made a contribution to that. And I think that contribution of Native Americans to the feast, I think, is really quite interesting. That this really was kind of a potluck supper in some ways. Everybody brought their bits and pieces, and Native Americans brought stuff too. And I find that quite interesting because it just does remind one about that there were a number of paths that could have lay ahead from 1620, 1621, and that conflict was not inevitable, likely, but not inevitable. And so I think something of the mythology of Thanksgiving is worth taking apart. And then I find it very interesting how it was then picked up again within the DNA of the USA. And my understanding is that there's no one tradition of Thanksgiving really for much of the 19th century, and different dates are used as well. And it only sort of settles in the latter half of the 19th century, post-Civil War. And so the history of how that becomes part of the cultural DNA, I also find that interesting because once something becomes settled, we imagine that's how people have thought about it forever. And clearly, Thanksgiving has been on a journey, as it were. And I think it's a wonderful celebration. But I think understanding the complexity of its journey is also really interesting as well.
Um, Another question that came in from Maggie was why it's about the number of saints that lived around North Nottinghamshire Shire and South Yorkshire in that area. If you want to comment a little bit about the religious aspect to where these people came from in England.
Yeah, yeah, this is really interesting. If you plot sort of the geography of ideology in the 17th century, you definitely find patches of England, particularly, where there's strong separatist, sort of non-conformist Puritan traditions, and others that are absolutely solid mainstream Anglican, for example. So I come from Somerset, and Somerset in the 17th century had a very strong, rather like Notts and parts of Lincolnshire, a very strong separatist nonconformist tradition. So, for example, one of my ancestors, so they're not Mayflower ancestors, one of my ancestors was called Gustavus Adolphus Whittock, and he was named after King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, who was one of the Protestant heroes of the 30 Years' War. Two others of my relatives, Whittocks, in England at the time, took part in the Monmouth Rebellion, which was the last rebellion of the godly, and some of my ancestors were hanged, drawn, and quartered for that part. So, what was it about Somerset? What was it about Nottinghamshire? What was it about London, for example? London had a very, very strong radical tradition. A number of things tended to produce these kind of patterns. One, the patterns tended to be strongest where there was some kind of economic base that freed people from more conservative relationships with landlords. So, for example, in areas where there was a stronger cloth trade, for example, or lace making, for example, around Nottinghamshire, you would find more independent artisans. London, for example, was full of its apprentices and so on and so forth. My area was a cloth producing area in the 17th century. And this tended to go hand in hand with more free thinking, more radical thinking, less conservative in their politics, less conservative in their religion. And remember that what we now regard as the godly were the radicals of their day. They were the radicals of their day. And mainstream members of the Church of England and so on really had real concerns about them. They regard them as being pretty extreme. And I think that once an area started to have this association, because there was persecution of these people, they could be fined, you could be imprisoned. This period of time, you're not going to be executed, but life can be made difficult for you. I think it like tended to attract like, because you felt there were people here that you could be in fellowship with, people who saw life the way you saw it. They looked at life through your lens. They were compatriots. You could have real fellowship with them. So I think often there's an economic base that explains why some areas are more free thinking and more radical. But once that establishes, it tends to pull people to it. It becomes a magnet. So you end up with lots of these little magnets around the country that pull other people who are separatists or non-separatists, but Puritans, the godly, who are wanting to create a new Jerusalem. But it's fascinating. And in fact, there must be a book in it. There probably is a book in it that actually charts the geography of religious radicalization in England in the 17th century. Now, that would be an interesting book, but it's not one that I've written.
We have some background noise here, so I've been frequently muting. Sorry about that. So another question came in from Brian. I think you may have gotten his interest with some of your books about the Vikings.
Mm.
Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the exploring, the fishing that, the fishermen that came to New England and this area up and down the coast before the Pilgrims, and
Yes.
just, how often, they may have come and visited, and if there were any, I think he's looking to see if there were any other earlier ventures to settle besides, up in this north area
Yeah,
of the
this,
coast.
this, this, this is really interesting because we tend to sort of see, Jamestown as the first big start in 1607. There have been some failed attempts before that. And then, of course, we've got 1620 with the Mayflower Pilgrims, and 1630, the big fleet arrives in Boston and so on. But by that time, there'd been over a century of movement from Western Europe to the Grand Banks, to the areas what we now call Canada, to the maritime provinces there, to what we now call areas of New England, right down perhaps as far as certainly maybe New York, certainly Cape Cod. What was going on here? Well, English and French fishermen had discovered that these areas were teeming with fish. Basque whalers from what's now northern Spain had sailed the Atlantic because they'd also heard this area was teeming with fish. And we need to unfit whales in their case, because we need to remember that although we're obviously very, very fixated on, Christopher Columbus and, 1492 and what have you, that within a decade of that, sailors were sailing from Bristol, which is not a million miles from where I live in the west of England, and they were making it to the North American continent. So John Cabot, for example, in the 1690s, they're getting to the North American continent. They are reaching Newfoundland, and they are reporting back and saying, this is extraordinary. The fishing here is amazing. The whales are really in great quantities. And so for that reason, there's been a century about before Mayflower happens on Cape Cod, of people sailing to the Grand Banks and then moving to the continent and then sailing down the continent, chasing fish stocks, chasing whales, for example. I mean, maybe getting down as far as Nantucket and so on, that sort of area, and putting ashore to get fresh water, to get fresh produce, to do some trading. And I'm sad to say, some of them doing some slave seizing as well, which is why Tisquantum gets grabbed when he's taken on board to do some trading. He's seized, and some of that's happening tragically as well. And what they're introducing is they're introducing pathogens. They're not mean to do this, but they're introducing pathogens to the East Coast. It's been estimated that some East Coast tribes had experienced a 90% die-off by 1620, such that when the Pilgrims arrive in their area, they find evidence for Native American settlement, but not no Native Americans in those settlements. They're there, but there are lots of deserted settlements as well. What's that about? It's because disease has already ravaged the east coast of what we now call the United States and Canada for a generation or two before the Mayflower arrives. And as I say, it's been estimated that some tribes had experienced a 90% die-off from diseases like mumps, smallpox, and so on, measles, which can still be killers, particularly land with a virgin population. And it's a virgin population. These people have never experienced this before by the time that Mayflower arrives. So these sailors, these fishermen and these whalers, they're also part of this extraordinary backstory, which is why people know quite a lot about Cape Cod and this area before Mayflower arrives. There is a backstory of knowledge going on here. They know something about this area because Europeans have visited it.
Thank you, Martin. So I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. We always try to promote this as a lunch hour show, and we are getting past now 1 o'clock. So I want to thank you all for joining us. We are recording it, and we will be posting it on the Alden website. And I hope you'll be able to share it with your friends. I want to also remind you about Martyn's book, Mayflower Lives, that is for sale through most of, the booksellers that you're familiar with, including online ones. Wonderful book. And thank you, Martyn, for your time and all the effort that you put into this. It was absolutely fascinating and we all enjoyed it so much. Our next program will be on love and courtship in Plymouth Colony on February 13th, and we will look forward to Dr. Ann Mason presenting that very fun topic. Again, thank you for joining us today. If you're interested in the Alden Kindred, please visit us at alden.org. Martyn, thank you again, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you in Duxbury again. Thank
That-
you all again for joining.
Thank you. And once again, greetings from the UK and my warm wishes to you all. It's been great to be with you this afternoon.
Thank you.